Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. Welcome to Left Side of the Aisle and me. I'm Larry Erickson. I'm your host, as you probably already figured out. And for the next half hour, I'm going to be talking about a couple of different things that I think are worthy of your attention. If you have any comments, questions, reactions to the show, you can send them to me directly. My personal email is whoviating, WHOVIATING at AOL.com. Or if you didn't catch that, go to my website. It's called Lotus, Surviving a Dark Time. And the URL will be here a couple of times during the show. And you can get the email address from there, or you can leave a comment there if you'd rather. If you do send me email, just please one thing, be sure to include something in the subject line that makes it clear this is about the show. It's not spam. And be a little patient about getting an answer because I'm absolutely terrible at dealing with email. So with that, we'll get on with it. We are going to be able to start with some good news this week, as I always like to when I can. In this case, it's good news in the form of an update about last week's report about the Democracy Spring protest in Washington, D.C. The Democracy Spring actions, which are now concluded, were a week-long series of workshops, rallies, speeches, and nonviolent civil disobedience, all around the theme of restoring the power of voting by doing things like restoring the Voting Rights Act, clamping down on voter suppression, and getting big money out of the political process. The last week I was able to report that in the first 2 days of the protest, over 500 people had been arrested in civil disobedience at the Capitol. By this past Monday, the last day of the protest, that number had risen to over 1,400, with 300 being arrested on that final day. This makes it the largest nonviolent direct action demonstration over a week in D.C.'s history. And this, in addition to all these, there were about 5,000 people who rallied on the Mall on Sunday. But right now, I need to make something, quite clear. When I said the Democracy Spring actions now concluded, I meant that particular week of protests has been concluded. Those protests obviously intended to draw attention to the issues involved. I think as part of what's involved in Democracy Spring is people going back home to their own constituencies, to their own organizations, their workplaces, their unions, their neighborhoods, wherever, and to their own home districts, and then to dig in with their own legislators to push them to support and vote for laws that would actually achieve some of these goals. Now, this is a new movement. It's really just getting started, but it represents people waking up to the erosion of our right to vote, and more importantly, waking up to the erosion of the meaning of our vote. So what we have to do now is, as the president of the NAACP, his name is Cornell Brooks, as he said to the crowd at the Capitol before he was one of those arrested, we have to stay woke. All right, next up, one of our regular weekly features. This is the Clown Award, given as always for meritorious stupidity. And this week, the big red nose goes to the state government of Utah. Now, Utah, like every state, has some problems related to the overall issue of public health. Things like poverty, pollution, people lacking access to health care, the kind of things you can find in every state, and they're certainly not unique to Utah. But the question is, among all the problems about public health, among all its problems, what did the state government of Utah find important enough, significant enough, threatening enough, damaging enough to declare in an official state proclamation to be a public health crisis? Pornography, dirty books, dirty movies. They are, the state formally declared, evil, degrading, addictive, and harmful, with wide-ranging harm to individuals and to society. They're like drugs and alcohol in their ability to tempt our youth into an addiction to porn, an addiction which parenthetically most researchers now believe does not exist. At a formal signing ceremony for this proclamation, Governor Gary Herbert declared that we hope people will hear and heed this voice of warning. The proclamation said there is a need for education, research, prevention, and changes in policy to deal with this scourge. And to show you just how serious they think it is, just how vital it is to act against this evil scourge, the resolution is non-binding and provides no funds at all for any of that education, research, or prevention. It couldn't be plainer than the big red nose on your face. Utah is governed by clowns. All right, next up, one of our other regular weekly features. This is the Outrage of the Week. And the Outrage of the Week this week is a tiny bit anachronistic because it involves something that occurred over a month ago, but which I just heard about in the last few days. Textbook publisher McGraw-Hill Education had put out a college-level political science textbook called Global Politics: Engaging a Complex World. The book was described as, quoting here, stressing the importance of global events and offering students a number of lenses through which to view the world around them, which seems like a laudable goal and suggests embracing the ability to recognize that not everyone views the world in the same way, that different people can interpret events and histories differently, and dealing with those differences is part of what's involved in engaging a complex world. However, it seems that in one area, differences are not to be allowed. In a discussion about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the book contains a graphic of these 4 maps. They're intended to illustrate the loss of Palestinian land over the recent, about 70 years. Now, there's some legitimate dispute about whether the map accurately the 4 maps accurately reveal what they say they do. One of those matters of different peoples having different interpretations of the same history. But interestingly, I will add, apparently no one disagrees with the notion that this last map, the one closest to me, that shows bits and pieces of Palestinian-controlled land engulfed in Israeli-controlled land, no one seems to claim that that map is inaccurate. The point here is that legitimate dispute about these maps was unacceptable. It was unacceptable to pro-Israel fanatics because it's not in line with official Israeli government propaganda. So no, those maps could not be one of a number of lenses through which to view the conflict. They were all lies, anti-Israel lies. And because they're anti-Israel, they are by definition anti-Semitic lies. Some of the complaints about these mendacious maps seem trivial, such as objecting to the first one, the oldest one, on the grounds that no one called them Palestinians at the time, and objecting to the second one on the grounds that the UN partition plan, which it displays, was never actually implemented. Some are head-scratchers, some of the complaints, such as objecting to the third map on the ground that there was no Palestinian-controlled land because there was no actual recognized Palestinian state. And some of the objections are just out of your mind nuts. Like the claim that the fourth map does show actual Palestinian-controlled lands, but that was because Israel created them in some otherworldly act of kindness, gentleness, and generosity toward the Palestinians. But never mind the objections, whether they're silly or whatever. No, it doesn't matter. The maps are all lies. All right, so what did McGraw-Hill Education do? According to a spokeswoman, quoting, "As soon as we learned about the concerns with it, we placed sales of the book on hold and immediately initiated an academic review. The review determined that the map did not meet our academic standards." She even lamely tried to suggest that the company really, genuinely, truly, we pinky swear, we have no idea how those maps got in there. The book was withdrawn and is being destroyed. In other words, McGraw-Hill Education ran. They said, as soon as we learned, we did this immediately, they ran to allow pro-Israel partisans to censor their textbooks. Because there are some lenses through which you are not to be allowed to look. In an open letter to McGraw-Hill Education, over 36 respected Palestinian, Israeli, and American academics called on the publisher to reverse its decision, which they called a shocking and unacceptable blatant act of censorship. What I call it is an outrage. All right, last before we go to the break. The drumbeat to renewed overt U.S. war in Iraq got a little bit louder on April 18th. with the announcement that Barack Nobel Peace Prize President Barack Obama is sending another 200 U.S. troops to Iraq, troops that will be embedded closer to the front lines than any have been before. The additional troops bring the total over 4,000 and exceed the previously declared cap on U.S. troops in Iraq, but that was no problem. Obama simply raised the cap. There are actually hundreds more U.S. forces in Iraq, but for various reasons they are not counted in that total. It is believed that the actual number of U.S. forces is over 5,000. The new forces are to be embedded as advisors, and when I hear this, I can't help but remember that embedding Americans as advisors is how the Indochina War got started. But they're to be embedded as advisors at the battalion level, which is significantly closer to the front line than the division and brigade levels at which they had previously been operating. In addition to these extra troops, the U.S. is supplying $415 million to the Kurdistan regional government, setting up a third long-range rocket artillery unit, and has agreed to employ Apache attack helicopters and the high-mobility artillery rocket systems, which are truck-mounted rocket launchers to support Iraqi forces looking to take Mosul away from ISIS or Daesh. Now, of course, even this is not nearly enough for some people. Senator John McCant, who never saw a war he didn't want to expand or blood he was unwilling to shed, dismisses it as grudging incrementalism and says it just proves the need for a vastly increased defense budget. I keep telling you, watch this space, because it keeps getting filled in little by little, and we are going to take a break. And here we are back. Back in February, I said I was then making one of what I said would be one of the very few and maybe the only comment I would make on the Democratic presidential primaries. It turns out that few rather than only was the proper term, because here's another one. All right, so as predicted, Hillary Clinton won the New York State presidential primary, won it handily, in fact by a margin that was slightly larger than what they call the poll of polls, the average of all the polls had actually predicted. Now, I'm disappointed by this, but I'm not surprised. Contrary to Sanders' strongest partisans, I never expected Bernie Sanders to win this primary, although it was pleasant to imagine it. My real disappointment here is that I had hoped the margin would be smaller than it was. I was actually hoping it might even be within single digits, but the thing is, the reason I never expected him to win was because it's a closed primary. You had to be a registered Democrat, in fact, registered since some months ago, in order to vote in it. And parenthetically, by the way, apparently making sure that you were registered and registered in the party you intended to be registered in was something of a problem. Some 126,000 voters in Brooklyn alone had been purged from the voter rolls, and apparently about 10% of the people who showed up in Brooklyn to vote on primary day were told that they couldn't. Now, the New York City Board of Elections dismissed the whole thing as, oh, nothing important. This is the same kind of thing happens in every single election, which is actually kind of creepy when you think about it. But the state attorney general, his name is Eric Schneiderman, he has a voter complaint hotline. And by 4 p.m. on primary day, that hotline had taken over 700 calls from across New York State, which is nearly 5 times the total number of calls for the 2012 general election. But anyway, getting back to the results. Again, the reason I never expected Sanders to win is that it's a closed primary. You have to be a registered Democrat. Across the campaign to date, Sanders has done best in open primaries where independents can vote. In fact, according to exit polls, he beat her among independents in those primaries by, amounts ranging from 15 to at one point like 40 percentage points. She, on the other hand, easily outdistances him among people who describe themselves as, well, I'm a Democrat, period. So the result is, if it's an open primary, good shot for Sanders to win, depending upon how many independents actually vote in that primary. Closed primary, you pretty much expect Clinton to win. Now, you can argue the merits of open versus closed primaries, but that isn't the point here. The point is that Clinton had a huge advantage going into this primary, an advantage that was reflected in the final results. What those results mean is that while it is still mathematically possible for Bernie Sanders to win the nomination, as a practical political matter, it ain't going to happen. Which really is the reason I even bring all this up, because the question becomes, what now? Now, the Clinton sycophants have an easy answer. Sanders should concede, withdraw, kiss the ring, and on bended knees swear fealty to all things Clinton, forgetting all this political revolution crap and devoting himself to upholding the status quo, which I don't expect to happen, and which, in fact, should not happen. The primary fight should go on because the fight itself should go on. Bernie Sanders has said far more than once that his political revolution is not about him. It's about, and now these are like my words, not his, so it's not a quote, but I think it's a fair reflection of the idea. It's about changing the nature and the structure of political, economic, and social power in our country, in our society. It is about racial, ethnic, gender, sexual equality, and freedom. It is about the economy, about an economy for the many, not the few, an economy for the workers, not the bosses, banks, and billionaires. It's about education, it's about health care, it's about housing, it's about peace, it's about justice. It's not about Bernie Sanders. It is not, and we must not allow it to be, about Bernie Sanders. But right now, he is the biggest symbol of that movement, a political epicenter of the drive, the thrust, the effort for those goals, for that kind of justice. Which is why the fights in the primaries must go on. They must carry all the way through to the convention, take the fight to the convention, take it to the Rules Committee, take it to the Platform Committee, take it to the floor, even take it to the roll call vote. And when Clinton gets a majority in that roll call vote, no, do not agree to a motion to make it unanimous. Let the convention be contentious. Let it be chaotic. But let it be clear that this is not the end. Let it be clear that, as he himself has said, this is not about Bernie Sanders. This is about change. This is about political revolution. So what we need to be thinking about now is how to carry on beyond the convention. When the powers that be have prevailed, as I unhappily expect they will, what then? An immediate question, of course, is how we deal with the general election. I think, first of all, that Sanders supporters are going to have to deal with the fact that, yes, he is going to endorse Clinton, and he will campaign for her if she asks him to. It's hard to imagine what he would say on her behalf, since she is exactly the sort of compromised, untrustworthy model of an establishment-favored and flavored candidate that he has slammed for over 40 years. But I'm sure they could find something. Anyway, each of us is going to have to decide how we deal with the general election, which actually brings up something else, and I'm going to go off on another tangent here, because I've never thought of myself as a Bernie or bust guy. In that earlier comment on the primaries, in fact, I said that if Clinton was the nominee, and if I lived in a toss-up state, which I decidedly don't, this state is sufficiently safe that usually we don't even see presidential candidates here, but if I lived in a toss-up state, I would have to choke back my bile and vote for her, because despite all the reasons I gave for why Hillary Clinton does not deserve the support of progressives, she was still clearly preferable to any possible Gopper alternative. Now, since I don't live in a toss-up state enough to make that decision, and I'm going to vote third party. The thing is, in the weeks since, and so I bring this up, in the weeks since I said that, I've become so disgusted with the Clinton campaign that I'm actually feeling pushed toward a Bernie or bust position. The utter ruthlessness, the callousness of that campaign has been astounding. And you got to make clear, I'm not referring to her supporters on social media. Her supporters there often go over the top with ridicule and mockery and lies and smears about Sanders rather, and his campaign and his supporters. And yes, the Sanders supporters will also do the same kind of thing, although I think not as often or not as bad. But the point is, I'm not talking about her supporters on social media. I am talking about the Clinton campaign, by which I mean the official campaign and her big name surrogates like Paul Krugman, Barney Frank, and Charlie Rangel. As an example, before the New York primary, Bernie Sanders said something to the effect that a big reason he was so far behind in delegates is because she did so well in the South, which is an area that no Democratic candidate is likely to carry, all of which is true. But to the Clinton campaign, this is proof that Bernie Sanders is a racist who dismisses the votes of Southern blacks as unimportant and thinks they're not even really Democrats. Another example, during a debate, he said something to her like, "Let me finish," and this was to the campaign proof that he's a sexist. In fact, pretty much any criticism he makes of her is called sexist by some Clinton surrogate or another. On the other hand, a Sanders surrogate used the phrase Democratic whores, and the world exploded. Even though in context, the meaning, referring to candidates compromise and that are beholden to big money interests, even though that meaning was clear. In fact, some people actually did point out that if this contest was between two men, no one would have flicked an eyebrow about that phrase. But because her, oh no, he's calling her a whore. During a debate, she was asked a question about his positions on guns. And he gave a chuckle, which any sane person would have read as him thinking, oh, here we go again. But in Hillary world, that meant he thinks that guns are a laughing matter and has no concern or compassion for the victims of gun violence. It's really getting harder and harder for me to imagine myself voting for her. Happily, I still won't have to make that choice, but others will, and best of luck to you in making your decision. Never forget that it is never a waste of your vote to vote for what you believe in. Eugene Debs said, I'd rather vote for what I want and not get it than vote for what I don't want and get it. But still, you have to make that decision, and for what it's worth, know that whichever decision you make, I'll have your back, whichever way you go. But that very consideration brings us back full circle to the question of what now? Because again, not only is this not about Bernie Sanders, it's also in the same sense not about elections. It's not even about voting. It's about the process of change. Voting is part of that process. Yes, it is. But so is petitions, lobbying, demonstrations, phone calls, sit-ins, all kinds of things. But because voting is part of that process of change, in a very real sense, for the moment, it is about Bernie Sanders for the moment because he is the vehicle through which that push for change is taking place. But after the convention, that campaign will be over, and he, in fact, may disappoint supporters by embracing, at least for the election, Clinton. But even then after November, the elections are over. The voting's done. Then what? Where do we go? What do we do? How do we keep pushing? The last time we allowed ourselves to get suckered into believing that change was all about an election, the result was we got the amazing Mr. O, and we spent the next years wondering how and when yes we can got changed into yes I might if it's not too difficult, and the rest of you need to shut up and get in line. We can't let that happen again if we don't want to feel responsible to have to spend the next 4 years explaining away new wars and new grand bargains with goppers and explaining why big money in politics is really, really bad unless the money goes to Hillary Clinton's campaign fund. We have to find ways to keep pushing. And I have to tell you something. tweets and Facebook posts and the like are not going to cut it. Period. They're not. They can be great for circulating ideas, for keeping spirits up, for passing on information, even for organizing, but they themselves won't change anything. Now, yeah, you can change little bits here and there. You know, you can find that a flood of tweets causes some store to apologize for something stupid they did, or maybe to get some restaurant to change a policy. And I'm sure somebody can come up with some bigger example of where it had a bigger impact. But in terms of changing the fundamental nature of power in the United States, there's no way they're going to do it. Way back in the dreaded 60s, I said something to the effect of, the system can withstand any number of people just saying no to that system. That's not enough. We have to do no. We have to act on our beliefs, and that is still true. We must act on our beliefs. If we're going to change, if we're going to actually have this kind of political revolution that we're talking about, if we actually want to advance these kind of ideals we're talking about, if we're actually going to change the nature of social power in this country, we have to act on our ideals. We can't just talk. We have to act. We have to do it, and we have to act in public. We have to be in the streets, even filling the streets. We have to be in the jails, even filling the jails. We have to be loud, noisy, disruptive, but most of all, creative. We have to be impolite, rude to power. And we have to not care what they will call us, because they will call us all kinds of things. But we have to not care, but just carry on. Now, I know all of this, it's been very rambling, it's been very disjointed, and it's actually based on some things I threw together about 3 a.m. this morning. And I know I haven't offered any concrete proposals, made any concrete specific actions, and that's because I don't have any to offer. What I want to press home, the whole point of this is to press home, is that if we actually believe in this political revolution we talk about, if we actually want to see in that biblical phrase that Martin Luther King, that wonderful phrase that Martin Luther King used in his famous I Have a Dream speech, if we really want to see justice rolling down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream, if we actually believe what we say, then it's time we look beyond the next primary, beyond the convention, beyond November, beyond political candidates, and ask ourselves, what then? That's it for this week. A reminder that because we take the last week of the month off, we will actually see you in 2 weeks. So you have the best 2 weeks you possibly can. And for now, as always, peace.